Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. Thanks so much for joining this next episode of In a Nick of Time. We're going to get started in about 10 minutes now with a great new guest, Richard Bird, joining us from Traceable. We'll be talking about API security and why it matters and why that might become the next biggest target of malicious actors. So stay tuned. We're going to get started in about 10 minutes. Also, if you've not registered yet, to the show, go to inthenickofTime.tv to register now so we can send you emails for the next videos and episodes. Finally, we're going to be launching a new company called Ask Sage, which will be using the OpenAI APIs with GPT to create the next generation AI assistant for government and DoD teams. So if you have interest and you want to discuss different use cases, we're going to be picking 5 use cases that truly impact the warfighters and the veterans as well. So if you have different ideas, reach out to us on LinkedIn so we can connect in the next couple of weeks before we get started with some of the use cases we already have. We have an MVP up, so if you want to get access to it, we can give you access as well. Just reach out to us on LinkedIn. With that, stay tuned for another 8 minutes. Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. Thanks so much for joining this next episode of In a Nick of Time. We're so excited today. We have a great guest, Richard Bird, joining us from Traceable. Before we get started, I want to remind everybody to subscribe to the mailing list. If you've not done that yet, go to inanicoftime.tv. So we're not dependent on social media to be able to reach out to you guys. Also, if you've not seen, we have learnwithnick.com is up with new videos every month, so go check it out. Massive discounts for veterans and early adopters here, so go check that out. Also, the latest videos that we posted last week is about SQL injections. So if you want to check the subject, and also let us know if you have a topic you want us to cover for the next videos. We're going to have a deep dive on how to make software more modular, which leads us to APIs and containers, which will be a great piece of the discussion of today. How to cut your monolithic stack into containers, and how do you assess security risks of these different modules, both open source, commercial, and of course government IP, and how do you do your assessment of those Lego blocks in a modular fashion so you can actually swap them instead of having a NIST package, an RMF package that would be kind of a monolithic architecture, so you can be more flexible and have the ability to deploy your software on different environments from the low side to the high side and so on. So that's going to be an interesting next video coming up. Wanted also to let you know about the In a Nick of Time store. If you go on store.inanicoftime.tv, 100% of the profits, and I say it again, 100% of the profits go to the Fisher House. So please go check that out. Helping obviously our veterans. Go buy a T-shirt or mug or whatever you want. We have a lot of fun stuff there. If you have ideas of other design, let us know. We can create that for you as well. Um, Quick announcement: we're gonna be launching a new company called Ask Sage. That's a breaking news here, with a chat bot using GPT dedicated to government and DoD teams. And so we already have about 17 teams that reached out when we posted about the bot on LinkedIn. But if you have use cases that you want us to look into with the bot, it could be very vast in terms of ability to summarize and provide insights, ingest data. We can do a lot of different things. In fact, we started by ingesting all our videos, and so now the bot is literally creating my next videos script. So I'm just a pretty face reading the stuff to you. That's how this is going to work now with technology. So if you have different ideas, reach out to us on LinkedIn with this GPT bot. We kind of focus on the veteran slash government DoD side to bring tangible value to the warfighters. Already great discussions in the AOC, AMC community, and the CDAO's office. So let us know if you have ideas. With that, wanted to bring in a second our guest. I want to give you a quick rundown of his background, which is obviously very impressive. Richard Bird is the Chief Security Officer of Traceable.ai. He's left the corporate world 5 years ago after 20 years as enterprise IT executive. He's held multiple C-level roles in his career to include CIOs and CISOs. Obviously, he started as the global head of identity for the consumer and commercial business of JP Morgan, spending 11 years with Chase. After that, he joined Ping Identity, which we had people of the Ping company here before, and he was the chief customer information officer over there. He's a senior fellow with the Zero Trust Institute. If you don't know the institute, go check it out. A lot of great publication engagements there. He's worked obviously extensively with the U.S., UK, European, and Australian government on different policy issues regarding cybersecurity. He's a speaker all over the place. You may have heard him already. Widely known as the guy with the bow tie, although he doesn't have one on the picture here. So we're gonna give him a pass there. But very famous, a lot of great speaking engagement. I've heard it many times speak. So we're very lucky to have him. If you want to follow him, of course, he's massive on LinkedIn. Goes allbird slash allbird on the LinkedIn.com link there, and go check him out. With that, welcome, Richard. Wait, I can't hear you. I don't know if it's me or if it's
Nope,
you.
I'm
Me.
here. I'm here.
Great.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Yeah, how are you? Good to see you. So excited. You have such a vast breadth of experience, both on the corporate side, which somehow some people make it look like dirty, which is not. It's actually a very different universe, obviously, between the product facing kind of companies and the service side and larger, Fortune 100 companies, obviously focused on both security and also compliance. So we'll talk today about API security. Before we get started, with your background, so different from everybody else that we know. Tell us a little bit about your journey there.
Yeah, my journey is completely accidental. So I came into IT. I had been in the service, and I came out during a military drawdown from active duty. I was an 82nd Airborne paratrooper all the way, and I came out during a military drawdown, and I went to work in construction project management, and went to work for a little company at the time that was struggling to reach its $100 billion revenue mark, which was Walmart, and opened up Northeast U.S., did a bunch of construction projects. And I didn't know at the time that there was a desperate need for experienced project managers in technology. So in the early 90s, somebody saw the potential in me and asked me to come to a payment processing company. And that started my IT journey. So 28-ish, almost 30 years later, I did the first half of my career in IT operations, heavy background in middle and back office processing for banks, and then eventually investment banking and hedge fund administration. And then economic downturn 07, 08, there was interest in creating the first centralized cybersecurity program, or information security at the time, at JP Morgan Chase. And I was invited to come back. And I joined, and that really began the second phase of this career with 100% focus on cybersecurity, working at scale and working at the scale and the size that you work at JP Morgan Chase. Gave me a lot of exposure. Did a lot of issue remediation with the Department of Justice, the Department of Defense, supporting our efforts at Chase with those organizations. And eventually, I just decided that it was time to hang up the spurs in corporate. I thought I was just going to take a bit of a break, and I joined a company where I was a strategic advisor for about a year. And I just had so much fun working with the solution side after having been the executive buyer and operator of those solutions. I was just having so much fun, and I was learning so many new things. The appetite for learning got me eager to stay in this space. Did a few years with Ping Identity, loved the experience, and then received a call from Sanjay at Traceable, who's one of the co-founders, and he said, "We need you to come work for us." So, love my opportunity now. I'm back in an operational space where I am the functioning chief information security officer for Traceable, but I also am doing all of my market-facing activities, working with governments, agencies, organizations, as well as speaking frequently, and working with the media on trying to help make the issues in cybersecurity a little bit more understandable to the average person, and thoroughly enjoying this journey. It's been amazing.
And that's what you've done, very well, is your ability to explain things so anyone can actually understand what's going on, right? I think that's one of your very special skills. Always very impressed with how you can summarize things. I've heard you speak a few times, and it's very clear that that opens the door to engagements with the government side, the leadership, Congress, but also Fortune 500 customers. Obviously, you've been on the other side of it. I like to believe it's more fun to be building this stuff and kind of touch a little bit of both. So you kind of you're kind of living the dream now, being in the middle of kind of both, because you get to still be, on the product facing side, but you still interact with leadership and have fun engagements with customers and government uh, all over the world, really. So obviously, so much to talk about. But when I started looking at it, obviously API is becoming really the foundation of how we do business. If you look at the Department of Defense, when we moved to Kubernetes and containers and started to cut the monolithic applications into Lego blocks, they turn into obviously a bunch of microservices and containers. And Kubernetes itself is just an API, anyways. So it's really becoming a world of APIs. Malicious actors obviously see that. For many years, people did not pay attention to API security whatsoever. There was always, API gateways and different pieces of the puzzle, but it's almost like people forgot about what we learned on the VM/ traditional security stuff we used to do 20 years ago. And when API came out, it's almost like people's brain resetted and forgot all the key principles of cyber until obviously some breaches happened again and people started to pay attention to API security again and bringing all the common sense cyber principles to the API universe. So when you look at what's going on, what do you see happening with all the market knowledge and the engagements you have when it comes to API security breaches?
I really like what you said about it seems like we've forgotten the patterns of the past. I raise that point a lot. And I think it's important to use that as a table setting for talking about what the current situation is with API security breaches. If we look at really how APIs developed, they were introduced a dozen years ago now. I think the white paper that announced the API economy was about a dozen years ago. And they sat relatively dormant for a number of years until we got into about the 2015-ish timeframe, and then really started to see exponential growth in the use of APIs to extract stranded business value from applications and data stores, and do that at that layer 7, right? If we look at kind of the old OSI 7-layer model, we're now virtualizing past infrastructure as a service, past OS. We're now virtualizing at the application layer. And that's where huge, massive amounts of transactions are now occurring, leveraging APIs. The problem is that, much like, kind of the past examples, APIs are being leveraged by the development community, and they've been largely leveraged without any security guardrails. Without any security guidance, without open standards. When you walk into any given enterprise, they may be using 4 or 5 different methods for API calls across 13, 15, 20 different groups. No centralization, no aggregation. So when we look at the current situation with API security breaches, what's very, very clear is that the attack surface has expanded exponentially while also diversifying from a fragmentation standpoint. Right, there are points of exposure now that are being offered up by open endpoints on APIs, misconfigured APIs that just simply don't have a parallel in our past experiences other than a wide open port. And when we look at what's happening from a breach and exploit standpoint, bad actors are really clearly capitalizing on the current state of confusion, division, and fragmentation in the way that we're managing API development and deploying APIs within the IT estate and also within the business estate. So bad guys know that this is, a big deal. We know this because 2022 marks the year that API breaches and exploits were the largest attack surface utilized by bad actors. And headline news was, substantial around API breaches coming in through the end of 2022. I always like to say that what we saw in the October-ish timeframe in Australia is the bellwether for what's coming in the United States, which were 4 massive customer data exposures in a row, the fastest set of linked exposures that I've ever seen in my working career that actually expose tens of millions of customer accounts, not just name and address, but sensitive and personal information. The MetaBank exposure now looks like it may potentially yield a $20,000 payment to every single Australian impacted by the MetaBank breach. It's unbelievable, the level of damage that can be done with APIs, and yet we're still arguing about the need for API security in most organizations and entities around the world.
So first, now I'm wondering why I didn't move to Australia so I could get the $20,000. We
Well,
don't get anything like this here.
yeah, it's only
That's for sure.
20,000 Australian dollars, so it's more like
Uh,
$13. No, I'm just kidding.
No, don't be too mean. It's like 15. So obviously, which by the way, if you look at Australia, they do, obviously the government is a little extreme sometimes. We're seeing it with COVID, but when you look at their understanding of privacy and data, before we dig into, the API side of things, what's your thoughts when it comes to the US lack of any type of regulation when it comes to privacy? You look at GDPR, of course, in Europe, which some people argue that might be a little bit extreme. Obviously, I'm not sure that led to cyber improvements, maybe compliance improvements. I don't know, but I've yet to see a lot of great outcomes, but maybe some maybe anecdotal stuff. But do you think we should do better here in the US when it comes to really understanding the importance of data, but also protecting it?
Without a doubt. But my I guess my reasoning and my rationale are a little bit different than taking the standard data privacy protection for data privacy protection's sake, which does seem to be kind of the guiding policy methodology used in the UK, EU, Australia. My attitude about this is the lack of a national data privacy standard in the United States has very clearly put us at an economic disadvantage from a global business standpoint, right?
Yeah.
If you are working, in a multinational corporation or a U.S. corporation trying to do business outside of the United States, the amount of friction that you have to go through in signing, managing, dealing with one-off singular data protection agreements or addendums is onerous. This is actually a case where the lack of regulation is creating more friction than if we had regulation. Now, the big thing that I see is that the real need for data privacy is simply to enforce a demand against corporations and organizations for responsible data stewardship. And one of the things that I really feel strongly about is you hear constantly, the cloud has generated all of this additional value. I'm old enough to remember that the original business value proposition for the cloud was we were all going to get compute for free. That didn't work out.
I pay quite a bit of money. Yeah.
Yeah, but what I don't think that it is the CPU that's available to us now, this infinite level of compute that's available to us now that's created the data privacy problem. I believe that it's the massive reduction in the costs of storage. And we used to have problems all the time in the enterprise of people keeping copies of copies of copies, and that's when our EMC, rigs used to cost us, hundreds of thousands of dollars. Now you can save anything all the time, every time. And because of this massive propagation of data that is a duplicate of duplicates of duplicates, we've just expanded the risk of that data by multiple times unnecessarily, right? Because cheap storage is available, because cheap storage is driven by cloud technologies. And I think that this notion of data privacy needs to be a demand for that reasonable stewardship for data and a true consumer protection level of data privacy, not another, you have to report your breaches, faster. Like I always say, like reporting your breaches faster is like the cops showing up at your house 2 days after you were robbed to tell you what was
Right.
stolen. It doesn't help
Right.
consumers at all. It doesn't help citizens at all. But I do think that there's room for smart conversations about this. But obviously, the current tensions and the year's worth of tensions in the House and the Senate have made it very, very difficult to make any progress. And yet, we're not acknowledging the fact that being behind on this is having an economic impact on our ability to do global business.
Yeah, spot on. Nothing that the term limits wouldn't solve, but that's a different problem. Let's look at let's look at the API again. People obviously argue API is it's just another traditional HTTP endpoint, although there's different use cases. But what makes API special and harder to protect, or are they even harder to protect, or is just a lack of due diligence?
Well, the beginning point of the conversation about why they're hard to protect is because virtually no company knows how many they have. There was a conversation that I was having over beers at the end of last week with an old colleague of mine. We've been working together for decades, and he asked me this same question, like, what makes them special and why they're hard to protect? And I said, well, first of all, let's not add to the mysticism of technology. They're not special, right? They're an enablement technology that allows us to extract value from assets and resources. But what makes them difficult to protect is, again, that repeat of a pattern. I can remember the days when I walked into data centers and there were conversations about how many firewall policies or rules do you have, and you would have your staff look at you and go, "We don't know." Right. And the lack of knowledge about those firewall rules in itself represented a risk. Now, it obviously was an undimensioned risk because you didn't even know how many you had. And this is what we're seeing replayed in the API space. We're seeing, it's almost like a repeat of the CASB days when people were like, how many cloud applications are your employees using? And us good executives would say, oh, I think like 30 or 40. And they go run the scan, you find out there's 400, web applications being used by your staff, of which you only know about 30. Right. And so these same kind of mechanics are happening with APIs. The problem is scale and volume. Right. APIs are able to be deployed rapidly. APIs are able to be done so in a way that is non-intrusive to kind of existing code states for solutions and applications. So you can work them independently. You don't bring down production because you've dropped in an API that's accessing sensitive data and pulling it from a source system and then delivering it back to an application, because you now have this middleman, right, with APIs. So it's this nature of an API to be outside of infrastructure, outside of application architecture, and independently operating, that makes them hard to protect. Because I'll go back to what I said originally. For a decade, we've put no controls, no strictures, applied no expectations for the use of a standard API structure or format within our organizations. And because of this massive amount of fragmentation operationally and technologically, it's incredibly difficult to attack your API problems unless you do so intentionally. Because you've got APIs transacting internally, externally, across third parties, old hosted arrangements, across your multi-cloud platform strategy. And these APIs are everywhere and not where they're being able to be seen and understood from an asset standpoint. And I think that's the big gap here to close out that comment, which is APIs today are hard to protect because they are not treated as the assets that they are. And they are absolutely assets that need to be protected and managed.
Yeah, I mean, you listed all of the key aspects, right? There's obviously also the piece of teams moving from a monolithic architecture to microservices, teaching agile methodology, starting with the Amazons of the world, moving to microservices, arguing that each team should be empowered to make their technology decisions and be able to run whatever tech stack they want to run, their own database and effectively endpoints. And you give them a lot of flexibility, picking their programming languages and technology stacks, and holding them responsible for managing it and running the operations of these services. But effectively, you also open the kind of worm of like everybody building things in vacuums and not having any type of cohesive cyber stack, which is why for me, I did this video on why Kubernetes is a must, not so much, even if you think it's overkill, that's the title of the video, because the Kubernetes structure and orchestration structure, ingress, egress, east-west traffic will give you the enforcement point centralized to not only get visibility on the east-west traffic and north-south traffic, but also an ability to enforce rules and runtime behavior technologies that can now not only give you insight as far as what's running inside of your clusters, but also what uh, components each of these containers are talking to, both internally but also externally. So I think that kind of orchestration stack and kind of the DevSecOps mentality and that move to orchestration, hopefully slowly but surely should start educating teams on the importance of having a layer of security there to pay attention to API security.
Absolutely. I actually really like a comment that I see from Tim about SOA, because I think that this is a really important example of understanding our history, right? If we look at SOA, SOA was an evolutionary leap from middleware. And for me, this is a really interesting point that Tim makes, because I was in the early days of middleware with Tibco in the late '90s, and as soon as we introduced the capability for this messaging architecture, it just got out of control, right? Because everybody that was in the business said, "Oh my gosh, this is so cool. You can extract all of this value. You can give me all of these capabilities and all of these features, and I don't have to get into some monolithic code deployment. So just give me another message," right? SOA, we did the same thing. It was anytime we introduce, and APIs are such a great example of this, anytime we introduce a transportation mechanism that is an intermediary or a way for us to tap the value of these assets in ways that we've never done before, which is the great business value proposition of APIs, it gets out of control. And it gets out of control because businesses are going to do what the businesses want to do. And security organizations, when we look exactly what's happening with security budgets today, virtually nobody on the planet has a discrete budget for API security. They may be trying to manage it within AppSec. They may be trying to manage it within DevOps, but they're not actually attacking the problem, which is an issue because if we go back to the SOA example, the longer you wait, the worse off you're going to be. The longer that we continue to not be serious about gaining control and management over these APIs, the more they're going to propagate, more zombie APIs are going to land in your organization, more undisclosed open public endpoints. This is not a problem that is going to age well. And like I said, I love the SOA example because SOA also created problems that did not age well, and as did middleware. So we either learn from our history and we learn from our mistakes, or we suffer greater consequences because of speed and volume, which API is exponentially faster in terms of its capability to deliver value and deliver damage than anything else that we've seen in our technology stacks up to this point.
Yeah, the other piece is the how short-lived containers and orchestrating those containers can be difficult because of that short-lived kind of identity, and so identifying APIs and things running inside of your stack it becomes harder now that we have this cattle versus pet mentality. So that obviously adds to the complexity of API security companies to really get the good visibility on what's going on, so they don't end up creating multiple duplicate of services and things. Particularly when you talk about horizontal scaling, but also canary releases, A/B testing, green blue deployments. So all this stuff adds a lot of complexity. And then, of course, you talked about the services that third-party services that applications are using, consuming from other companies.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, the third party equation is kind of fascinating because a tremendous amount of your third party interaction now is being driven at the API layer, and If we think about, large, let's just, say Fortune 100 companies that are struggling with this issue, and not yet attacking it programmatically, and that's really what needs to be done. You just have to attack this thing programmatically again. But when we look at this, if these Fortune 100 companies have networks of, hundreds, if not thousands of partners, and those Fortune 100 companies are struggling with API security, and you're interacting with those third parties, and their level of maturity is substantially less than yours as a Fortune 100 company, you really need to be pausing and understanding the risk that you're exposed to. And it's very fascinating to see that, this reality of risk hasn't quite registered yet, particularly in North America, but it hasn't resonated yet in a way that's driving action. Can I, if I could, Nick, I'd love some of the comments here as well.
Yeah.
That there's Siddharth makes a comment about what are the best methods to make APIs robust and secure, and any new alternatives for APIs. Well, look, I don't think that there are alternatives for APIs, because I actually think that APIs are the path for the next 10-year. Most technology cycles run in 10-year waves. And I think that, we're just seeing the beginning of the capitalization on APIs, from a business value standpoint. And unfortunately, it's like meth, right? As more people, yield or gain value from the use of APIs on the business side of the equation, they're going to want more and more and more. But to take it back to how do you make your APIs robust and secure, again, this is a pattern, and it raises some questions about whether or not as human beings we have the capability to learn and modify our behaviors. And by that, I mean a good API is a documented API. So here we are years later, we used to say good mainframe code was documented mainframe code. Good client server code was documented client server code. And what happened, through the course of our careers? Nobody documented their stuff, right? Now, what's interesting in the API security space, and Traceable excels at this particular piece, is that the ability to do auto discovery and cataloging while also enriching APIs without any documentation, because cool things about APIs, they're always designed for a very specific purpose. It's only when they start doing things that they're not supposed to do or weren't designed for that they're a problem. And because of the nature of the code that's required to create APIs across all the different variations, graph and REST and SOAP and all of that, you can divine what they're intended to do, and you can actually auto-populate documentation, which is absolutely critical. It's bad enough to not know what your APIs are, but if you don't know what your APIs are doing, that's an even worse situation from a risk standpoint. So robust APIs and secure APIs require understanding, knowledge, and then the capability to be able to monitor their changes and deviations over time. This is one of the really interesting problems with APIs. Back to the why are they hard to protect? Bad actors have figured out that they can leverage APIs to do low and slow attacks. Again, this is a repeat of a pattern. I lived through a massive east-west breach leveraging SSH keys more than a decade ago, where a low and slow attack allowed those attackers to be inside of the network for a year. Right. We're seeing the same things happening with APIs, that they can be modified slightly over time to be able to pivot them to deliver, bad, outcomes. So that means that a secure and robust API absolutely has to be understood, obviously cataloged, and then monitored consistently to make sure that it is doing what it is supposed to be doing and nothing else. And those are the key characteristics of a program that's attacking APIs in a way that results in secure and robust results.
That's the beauty also of APIs, right? Like you mentioned, because they're designed, at least if you do it well, they're supposed to be doing a very precise thing. It enables machine learning, particularly, to do a very good job at tracking what that API is doing, what is pulling, what is connecting to, what is talking to, volume of data being, pushed into different requests. So that gives you an edge there to protect it for behavior detection, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, behavior detection is interesting. This kind of gets back into my favorite subject. Folks that may have followed me over time know that I've been a really vocal voice in identity security and digital identity for quite some time. And this idea of behavioral patterns or behavioral analytics associated with APIs dovetails very, very nicely with what we've learned and come to understand with an API. Like if you think about the API, OWASP top 10, API security OWASP top 10, 30% of the OWASP top 10 are actually tied directly to identity principles, authentication, authorization, and business object level authorization, or broken object level authorization. This authorization and authentication set of mechanics means that you have the capability to see how an API behaves with what it is intended to transact with, and in times when it's transacting with something it's not supposed to be intended with. And it's understanding that normal baseline of the API behaviors divined from the code itself inside of the API that gives you the possibility to see those anomalous events based on behavior patterns, right? APIs are highly transactional. So once you have the ability to understand what that API is doing, the monitoring over time gives you the opportunity to be able to see it behave in a way that it's not supposed to. And the behavioral analytics then can be leveraged for additional workflow automation orchestration, for basically shutting off access in actual runtime, executing additional acquisition information, for SOCs. I mean, there's just so many different things that you can do with it. A lot of it is just simply reusing best practices from other security domains. But for the most part, this is a situation where I saw a comment in here about 100,000 API partners. I actually know one company that's got 34,000 APIs currently. So the numbers are staggering, right? And this gets back to the point that I made. If you want to be able to do this cool stuff, you got to start out with understanding what you have to begin with.
Yeah, it's always back to asset management, right? And understanding and tracking assets. So you talk about identity, so that's interesting because obviously that's a very key piece of cyber as a whole.
Yeah.
But what, obviously APIs often are consumed by people talking to systems, but also non-person entities talking to other APIs. So you have this kind of short-lived tokens and access control challenges there.
Yeah.
What do you see is different with API identity management?
Well, there's a commonality and a difference in that commonality. So, spending so much of my time in identity, I say this just being brutally honest, right? Identity is the forgotten cousin on another continent when it comes to identity or it comes to security controls, right? And we know this because 80% of all breaches have some identity related aspect to them and have for nearly 20 years, right? So we know that the identity plane from a security standpoint, from a control standpoint, not access management or administration, but from a control standpoint, has been extremely problematic, has been underfunded. And as I heard a CISO say just a couple months ago at a conference, is just infrastructure and nobody wants to invest in infrastructure. We see a repeat of some of those kind of negative impacts to the API space. But there's a lack of appreciation for the notion of APIs making authorization calls, authorization being one of the least secured components of the security stack. There's a problem with persistent authentication, which, I mean, in and of itself is an immediate violation of anybody trying to build a zero trust architecture. You don't allow persistent, authentication, but we have APIs with open authentication calls that never terminate, that never are inspected. So we're seeing the same kind of problems that have been present within the identity management space manifesting in the API space. And I'll emphasize it again. The problem being, volume and issues associated with the sheer number of APIs and how fast and how many times they're interacting with assets and resources. But I think that there's another piece that's really coming to light. And I'm working on this with a couple of companies in stealth, and I'm working on it with, policymakers as well, which is I do think that there is the possibility that API is the death of static encryption. I think that when we look at AES, when we look at the reality of where encryption is today, we don't have a lot of excuses for not having pioneered more elegant forms of encryption. Encryption that changes keys on a transactional basis per transaction, right? Making it very, very difficult for those tokens to be reused, those tokens to be minted and forged that we saw in the Golden SAML attack and SolarWinds, making it very, very difficult for those types of scenarios to play out. And dynamic encryption may be where the big change starts to happen in API, separate from identity management, because it does seem that leveraging something like dynamic encryption will deliver greater security across the API landscape. But it is, new days. I mean, Professor Knudsen brought up dynamic encryption in 2015. It's still, highly academic. Like I said, a number of companies are taking a look at it. But we've got to get away from this static key world. If for no other reason than quantum's already proved that static keys aren't going to work either.
Yeah, no doubt. So in fact, you mentioned the short-lived tokens. A lot of breaches recently, right, have been leveraging access to tokens from users to access GitHubs and repos and different things, Jira, Atlassian, whatever, right? So do you see like the duration of the tokens, and also, another massive threats I've seen recently is on the DevSecOps tooling side. You have a lot of tokens that are multi-tenant, meaning multiple customers access maybe some scanning tool, and the scanning tool communicates to the CI/CD pipeline and has the same key across all the tenants inside of that pipeline. And obviously, if someone gets that key, they can do a lot of damage. Do you see like the multi-tenancy, non-person entity? And I don't see anyone even paying attention to how these tools communicate and how that can be done in a more secure fashion per tenant or per user, um, to have a more granular understanding of what they do. Do you see that as a big piece of the identity threat there?
Yeah, without a doubt. And this is, it's kind of frustrating, right? Because the examples that you just gave for, kind of cross tenant, cross cloud provider access, look, obviously those aren't being executed for security reasons, right? They're being executed to achieve, business value, which is great. But this rush to achieve business value at all cost, particularly at the cost of security, just creates these significant problems that are so rooted in what we already know. I mean, the folks that are following on the chat, like, does anybody question the fact that they're the three biggest weaknesses for nearly 30 years in security have been DNS, encryption, and identity? And we
Right.
all know this, right? And yet we see organizations, companies, cloud providers who are actively ignoring what we intuitively know are the weaknesses, and recrafting and rebuilding those same weaknesses into those new architectures over and over and over again. And obviously that kind of brings up the old Descartes or Disraeli or whoever you believe said it, right? That is the doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. Yet when we look at the kind of the yield curve of cyber losses, cybercrime, breaches, exploits, it keeps going this direction, right? It is a hockey stick going up and to the right, and we keep standing around going, I don't know why it's happening. And then we go, but DNS, encryption, and identity still have not been effectively treated and or solved for from a security standpoint, and we go keep building stuff that ignores those facts, right? And I think it's unfortunate because we in the security community can crow all we want about knowing that these are the problems, but as if the business side of the organization continues to drive for growth, feature functionality, capabilities at all costs, without understanding that we really already understand what the weaknesses are and how to remediate them, we're not going to see substantial changes anytime in the future.
And part of the issue is, big companies don't really know how to deal with this. The small companies just want to innovate and raise money and sell. So they don't really have this long-term vision of sustaining the business. So it's just about business, fast and quick, no matter the consequence. So that's always a pretty scary universe. So we talk about obviously identity, but you mentioned and I mentioned multiple times as part of the security landscape of security nowadays, you cannot claim you're doing anything close to zero trust without continuous monitoring. Obviously, we know it's an essential piece of security, but how does that play when it comes to runtime security with API security?
Yeah, runtime is where it's at, but it also presents us with a historical problem. um, it's really interesting. There is a characteristic about APIs that I find, and I think most of the industry finds very interesting and unique, um, which is that APIs, because of the tentacles that are associated with what they reach out to, um, they may be reaching out to services and or data stores that you aren't even aware of, kind of second, third, fourth line down that transactional chain, is that you can do a great job at AST and do your, API testing, through your agile sprints and, come out clean. You do a great job, kind of post testing as you're in production, and then everything can go wrong, right? Because APIs can introduce behaviors post implementation or post production that none of those things catch, which really emphasizes the need for runtime security. A minor change to access a separate or different data store, or possibly route traffic to an embargoed nation, or there's so many different variations of these use cases. None of those might manifest in your actual day-to-day development, building, deployment of these APIs. But then 3 months after you've deployed it, all of a sudden it does. Now that gets into you've got to catch that with the behavioral and the analytics associated with understanding your baseline. But then you obviously need to be able to take action, right? So the executing of an action in runtime is absolutely critical in the API space. Now, the reason why I say it has historical problems is, and I've experienced this in many conversations with many organizations, is they go, "Oh, that's great. We absolutely need that." And then you go, "Cool. So what's going to happen is that when runtime security is executed for this particular API, if it notices traffic coming out of the Ukraine, or it notices traffic coming out of Uzbekistan, or it's got traffic that's being routed out of North Korea, we are going to terminate the ability for any of those nations to be able to utilize that API." And then the business owner looks at me and goes, "Whoa, whoa, whoa. Well, we can't automatically shut that off, because we might actually have a customer who's in the Ukraine and traveling at that time. And we can't inconvenience a customer for the sake of the massive amount of risk that's being introduced by the nations that are currently, utilizing this API." And I don't even say that tongue in cheek. I mean, that was actually a real conversation. And so, when we look at runtime related security controls, they have always been marginalized in terms of operationalization by companies because of concerns about production or customer impact or transactional impact. Those types of concerns are warranted, but they're rarely ever dimensioned against the broader amount of risk that's associated with the use or leveraging of any given technology, but specifically APIs.
Yeah, no doubt. Yeah, that's a pretty interesting example from that customer. Obviously, I get the point of disrupting customer engagements, uh, but yeah, at the same time, there's a balance to be found, and then people struggle with the balance, right? And then you end up in a disastrous situation with tremendous cyber exposure, and then the customer leaves because he's upset that you lost his data. So I don't know which one is
Yep.
worse, but so obviously, when you look at APIs as a whole, do you find them to be bringing some additional security problems?
Yes. The additional security problems really kind of orbit around the ability for bad actors to conduct these nuanced changes, or changes over time to the APIs, right? I think that this is a challenging space for APIs in general, because um, most companies struggle with barefaced attacks, right?
Hmm.
Like you actually know something is wrong, and you're trying to respond in real time to take action and mitigate that risk. And that's not a negative statement. I mean, I've been a CISO. I've run security organizations that span 72 company or 72 nations, including China. Right, it's a hard job, and but the this ability for the tweaking of APIs, and also introducing APIs into kind of the OSS space and embedding problematic APIs with concealed capabilities is very, very troubling from a security standpoint, right? Now, the easy answer to that is simply rehashing many of the points that we've made throughout this conversation, right? Know your APIs, ideally know your third parties APIs, understand what they do, monitor them over time. But I do wonder if the API layer has a has a has more of an inherent weakness relative to its ability to be leveraged to do bad things in ways that are very, very difficult to divine or catch. So I think that I really think that that's an open-ended, statement and observation to the broader community. I think it begs conversations around efforts for, say, an open standard for API development, and as well as documented standards for APIs within organizations, so that you don't have all of these disparate methods to call APIs. That you're honing things down to industry strength, supported and understood API structures. And as long as this kind of level of diversity from a deployment and a development standpoint persists within organizations, I think it introduces the possibility for a new class of security issues.
Yeah, no doubt. Interesting. Interesting. So, we talked about the government use cases a little bit, and before leaving the government, one of my last contribution was to help with the president executive order on zero trust and SBOM. Um, what do you find that executive order's implication to be when it comes to API security?
Well, there's definitely been an immediate operational impact that I've been experiencing in conversations with government agencies and organizations over the last several months, which is, however it was crafted, kind of post EO into administrative orders. Uh, Large numbers of government agencies clearly understand that they need to have a inventory of their APIs.
Hmm.
Those conversations I'm having weekly, right, with organizations, and I think that this is a space where the pub or the government sector, at least notionally or intellectually, may be ahead of the private sector. Because in conversations with government agencies, one of the things that I find really encouraging is that there's a clear understanding of the threat and risk of APIs. Now, some of that is structural, because as you know better than I do, lots of government agencies are either currently in the midst of a cloud journey, or they may never embark on that cloud journey, right? They may stay landed asset because of mission critical factors, or needs for confidentiality, state secrets, those types of issues. So they may be in that landed data center world for eternity, right? And yet they're also trying to maximize the value of their data assets and their application assets, which they're doing via APIs. So I think that people that have worked in kind of a that solid government structure, data center, tight controls around application development, all those types of things, they immediately know the risk that APIs represent to them, because they're using those APIs to open up their world, and anything that equates to opening up their world is treated with caution, right? So I'm definitely seeing a lot of those activities now. there is a broader misunderstanding, I think, at the EO level. As we know, executive orders aren't particularly detailed or granular in their detail. So there were a lot of question marks about where does API fit within a zero trust framework as a result of the EO. And I think that those conversations are ongoing. Obviously, the work that I'm doing with John Kindervag and Chase Cunningham and Eve Mahler and Greg Twill around zero trust. Those conversations are about progressing the zero trust architecture conversation into that layer 7 in a lot of enthusiasm to do so. But if the folks that are in kind of the ZT, kind of thought leadership space are just now thinking about this, obviously, when we look at it from the EO and the government, standpoint, there's got to be still a lot of operational confusion on how to execute on an API security program or strategy within these agencies. So I think that the answer to that is that this is a news story in progress when it comes to ZT and API security, particularly within the federal government. But there is a somewhat of an intuitive and inherent understanding of the risks that APIs expose government organizations to, which is causing them to move, fast in relation to how fast government agencies normally move. They're moving a little bit faster than I've seen in the past on different other types of initiatives and accords.
Yeah, that's been improving. It's a journey, but I think the more people are getting used to cloud and now, data centricity, zero trust, I think obviously that starts to adjust the brain in terms of speed and ability to move at the pace of relevance for these teams, and that's great to see. But it's definitely a pretty heavy lift. So
yeah, agreed.
So, looking at API security for a lot of our audience, obviously being targeted by nation state actors, what do you think is the value for these actors?
Wow, the nation state space troubles me as it relates to API security. If we look at nation state activity around citizen data enrichment, I'll be very, very specific about a use case, right? And we see a breach, like Optus had in Australia, a cell phone service provider, mobile provider in the APAC region, and we see 40 million unique customer accounts that are scraped off of an open API endpoint. That data, a lot of times, this audience will appreciate this. A lot of times the news stories are out there, flashing about how, somebody else's, customer store was breached and their information is being sold on the dark web for whatever. That's, to me, that's disingenuous, because in reality, the nation state actors are gobbling that information up to create detailed profiles about human beings, not just in the United States, but all over the free democratic world, right? And we know this because we know what we learned about what China was trying to accomplish with the OPM breach years ago, which was to create detailed identity profiles for each American citizen, right? Especially those that had access to sensitive operations and infrastructure. So, the things that we see in the media that just seem to dismiss the importance of the value of the information that's being exploited through APIs takes everybody's eye off the ball as it relates to nation state. And so, what I'm concerned about is that API exploits are continuing to provide important, detailed digital ammunition for our adversaries at the nation state level. And now the reason that I have those concerns is because, as we've already acknowledged, the vast majority of organizations, agencies, as well as companies still do not have a programmatic approach to API security. So as long as those assets stay vulnerable via APIs, nation states are going to be capitalizing on that exploit and attack surface as often and as fast as they can, which we again are already seeing. So this is, my concern is that this API security space, because of the lack of attention that it truly deserves from a risk standpoint, is just creating greater and greater advantages for our adversaries in the nation state space.
Yeah, that's a pretty scary, universe we live in, I guess. But that's a real world, no kumbaya in DoD. We can't do like all friends in Silicon Valley all the time.
Yep.
We have to deal with the real world.
Agreed.
Um, so obviously, Traceable has been really pushing the envelope when it comes to paying attention to all these issues and providing solutions to not only the commercial side but also the government. What have you seen? You started, what was it, 4 or 5 months ago? I forgot.
Yep. About
Something like
five.
that. Yeah. What have you seen now that you've been there enough to have an opinion, I guess? What have you seen makes you addressing the problem differently from others?
Well, I think a lot of that goes to the genetics of Traceable and our founder and co-founder, Jyoti Bansal. For anybody that has not heard of
He's a
Jyoti,
guest on the next episode, by the way.
excellent,
Next,
excellent.
but he's gonna come talking about Honest, his other company,
Yep.
because he's sleeping all day. So he has a fund, he has a Traceable, and he has Honest. So that's all
Yeah.
he does.
And,
Is
well, and
is is a boring guy.
yeah, it's absolutely, again, for folks that are, watching today, if you've not done any research about Jyoti Bansal, I definitely encourage you to do so. And the reason is that I say that is because, Jyoti spent a number of years building a company that a lot of people are familiar with, App Dynamics. And in building App Dynamics and subsequently selling it the day, it's almost legendary, selling it the day before IPO to Cisco. Um, he really embarked on, he was the pioneer in the space where Dynatrace and a number of other companies are today. And he rooted his understanding of application behaviors and risk and exposure at the analytical level, right, at the code line level. And in doing that with App Dynamics, it gave him the knowledge and the experience to attack the API security space with the same kind of lens, right? This ability for us to divine data and understand the behaviors of the APIs at the core code level all comes from what Jyoti built before. Obviously, he's now applying it to a different use case and a different set of technological and business problems. But I do think that that's where the big differentiator is. And important industry secret that I love about this company after 5 months with them. There is a cohort, and I won't say the numbers because it is one of our key differentiators. But there are a substantial number of developers and engineers that have been with Jyoti for more than a dozen years. And like I like to say, they don't just finish each other's code, they finish each other's sentences. And when you have a group of developers and engineers that can turn a feature request around in days, not weeks or months, you have a distinct advantage to innovate, a distinct advantage to deliver additional value, and be able to respond to not just changes, but new understandings and new discoveries within the API security threat landscape at light speed, which nobody else in the API security business can do.
The team is very impressive. I think the ability for Jody to retain the talent and get them to stay with him for so many years tells you not only the kind of leader he is, but also kind of the visionary aspect of his brain. That's always pretty impressive to me. We're gonna have him next Tuesday, 1 p.m. Everybody, so get excited. That's gonna be a fun episode. So with that, what do you think? uh, all the challenges that we see now with the economy? And do you feel like, investing and kind of targeting also the federal side is kind of a great idea for companies like you, despite, obviously the federal side being very slow. It's also a market that doesn't slow down when there's a
Yeah.
recession. So do you find it to be a great crutch in that use case?
Well, there's an advantage to the current economy as it relates to a company like ours doing business with the federal government agencies, which is the current economy gives us the luxury of time, right, to be on the government schedule timelines and timeframes for decision making, where we're not pushing as fast as possible to close a deal, which is unrealistic in a great economy. But in an economy that we currently have, it gives us the opportunity to do that work from a business development standpoint in a much more measured, much more detailed, much more valuable way with our government agency buyers and counterparts. So this is the challenge with like our past 7 or 8 years economy, is that it creates so much momentum in the private sector for selling and executing on deals that you take a look at the government sector and you go, well, do we really want to go spend a year and a half in that space, with no additional revenue dollars, being generated, when we can go put all of our marketing dollars and energy into the private
Mhm.
sector? And unfortunately, that's the way that the sales game works, right? If there's tons of dollars to be had on this side, why am I going to go through the challenging procurement cycles that are associated with the federal government? Obviously, once the economy changed, then that kind of changes companies' expectations, because I can tell you internally at Traceable, and I've made this comment many, many times. We look at the situation as, by the time we are, delivering value to our government agency partners, we will be out of this economic cycle. We know that that's going to happen, right? We watch all the trades and see what's going on in global economy just like everybody else, and that's an ideal situation for us, because we'd rather have the solution up in production and running, delivering value and mitigating risk, than being arguing about contractual terms. So now this gives us the luxury and time and space to be able to do that effectively.
Yeah, no doubt, no doubt. Um, and I guess tied to that, right? What keeps you up at night?
Wow, what keeps me up at night is the basics. This is I think that the most catastrophic learning that I had coming into information security, cybersecurity years ago, was how bad we are at doing the basics. And I'm gonna show a little of my stripes on my sleeve when I say this. Like, the reason that you do DNC, the reason that you do range qualification, the reason that you are doing these practices and field exercises in when you're in military service, is so you become a master of the basics. And the number of companies around the world that are not masters of the basics is disappointing. One of the examples that I give frequently is I've had companies that have talked to me and said, prior to my Traceable time, who said, I want this capability and I want biometrics and I want this, that, and the other. And I immediately say, well, you're a hybrid environment, right? And they say yes. And I said, when was the last time you hygiened your Active Directory environment? And the room goes silent, right? And I'm like, so how about you come back and talk to me after you've hygiened your AD? Because all of the inherent risk that you currently have in your identity space is bound up in the fact that you haven't cleaned up your Active Directory in 20 years. And it's those basic mechanics being missed in companies around the world and organizations around the world. And I'm not telling tales. You guys see this in the news every single day, and you go, really? That's how you got breached? Like, you got breached through something as simple as that? That those are the dynamics that exist today within the security world that make it really, really hard to go to sleep sometimes.
Do you find the U.S. companies to do better than European and Chinese and maybe other countries, or where are we standing when it comes to the defensive side, I guess?
I don't know if it's a universal global human characteristic. I actually think that the vast majority of the world, regardless of where on the continent they're located, it stinks at the basics. And it makes sense because most I get pushback on the military example, right? In the military, the demand is to be disciplined by design, and most companies and organizations can't be disciplined by design. When we look at the China example, we could say, China probably gets the basics better, done better, because of the nature of their government and their society. But if you look at breach reports and you look at how Chinese companies and organizations get hacked and exploited, which is easier to do, by the way, if you're in the APAC region. That news doesn't necessarily get reported really heavily here in the United States for some reason. You'd see that they make the same boneheaded mistakes on the basics on a pretty reasonable or a pretty regular basis. So I think it more speaks to universal human characteristics, and also this I mentioned it earlier, and also this need for us sometime to ascribe a mysticism to technology that it doesn't deserve. Technology is a means of production. Technology is a better tractor. And when we start treating it like it is something different than that, we begin to neglect the basics because they're not cool and sexy, and they don't add to the mysticism and mythology of our technology footprint. And I think it's all of these kind of human characteristics that have led to this absence of detail, focus, and operational excellence on the basics.
Yeah, that's interesting, right? Because obviously development teams and IT teams that are passionate about technologies are usually the best ones, but also then they have the bias of getting excited by shiny objects, and so they're gonna do they're gonna focus on the shiny things and forget about the basics. That's why I keep looking at assessments. I remember at DHS when I assessed critical infrastructure companies and teams. Honestly, the results were so bad it was mind-boggling. But it's also like all the basics were not even thought about. It wasn't even like part of the discussion.
Yep, absolutely.
That's a interesting kind of human trait. Obviously, consequences can be different based on the organization. We have a couple of questions from the audience. Um, One is about what do you see um, in the between the evolution of service mesh and APIs. What do you see the impact of service mesh being to API security?
Yeah, that is a great question, because I actually meant Nick and I were having a conversation earlier today, and I meant to actually bring up this discussion about mesh, which is the architectural concept that is getting a lot of play recently. I obviously, I think from an evolutionary standpoint, service mesh is the direction the world's going. But I actually think that substantial amounts of the threads that are used to weave that mesh, if I can extend the analogy, are going to be API and microservices. So I think that, I think that that mesh plane then is highly dependent upon, I'll use the term that was mentioned by Siddharth earlier, robust and secure APIs. If we haven't emphasized that point in this conversation, we're not in that world yet, which raises concerns that if we push rapidly into these notions of mesh, whether they're identity meshes or service meshes, network mesh, that this absence of robust and secure APIs from a programmatic standpoint are going to create are going to create mesh situations that are corrupted or co-opted on arrival, right? That's not the ideal state that we want, because I do believe in the value that these mesh approaches are going to deliver. All it is again the further virtualization and obliteration of a perimeter and firewall based world, but it's going to be highly dependent upon robust and secure APIs.
Yeah, no doubt. And yeah, so definitely the mesh market is booming, and the API market is booming, and all of them are intertwined into this web of complexity. So that's going to be an interesting evolution. Someone was asking on Twitter, effectively, what is the uh, interconnect or the future of API gateways now in the world of Kubernetes and service mesh, I guess.
Yeah, that's a also a great question. API gateways are a bit strange from my perspective, in that the value proposition that they launched themselves on was pretty pure and pretty simple, right? They like I always like to say, the API gateway is just basically the equivalent of a router. It's
Yeah.
dictating the directions of API traffic, not network traffic, but it's the same fundamental principle. And when we look at the API gateway space, you would assume that API gateways would be rapidly evolving to accommodate for all of the different aspects of operational and security management of APIs, and they're not. Which that's the piece that I find very strange. And the window of opportunity for them to do so is probably past when we look at a MuleSoft or an Apogee or Nginx or any of these other gateways, because the reality is that just towards the end of 2022, what I like to call the sleeping giants awoke around API security. Now, some of this is driven by Gartner's definition on CNAPP, and some of it's driven by kind of the market growth in SASE and XDR, and everything that's going on the discussions relative to edge. But when you look at what's happening in the marketplace, organizations like Palo Alto, F5, Microsoft, even Cisco, all of them are beginning to make comments, statements, and movements relative to API security. So when we look at the gateway space, I think that there was an evolutionary opportunity for them to grow their capabilities across API operations management and security. They did not do so. They stayed in a specific lane, and as a result, I think that the energy. This is speaking from the startup solution side of the equation. The investment energy associated with achieving those capabilities is now being oriented towards companies like Traceable, and also investment funds or dollars available for R&D in these sleeping giants is beginning to be activated. So I don't think it necessarily means that API gateways are going the way of the dinosaur. I think it means that one or two stay as probably standalone entities, and the vast majority of the gateway market gets absorbed into the capabilities of any of these other larger companies that I mentioned.
And so some people argue that the mesh, now that the mesh is doing ingress egress, is gonna probably disrupt drastically uh, the API gateway market as well. So
It will. I think the only caution that I would give on that note is that everybody that's watching this right now, and then myself included, we're all going to be dead and buried in the grave before hybrid IT is done. The reality is that obviously 97% of the world's compute on a nightly basis is still done by mainframes. AS400s are a thing. Mid-range is still running in many companies.
yeah.
Vast Linux farms. Like the reality is the API gateways will definitely have a necessity, but it may be in a much more diminished capacity, as you mentioned, as mesh continues to achieve its goals.
Yeah, no doubt, no doubt. An unrelated question for you, I guess, but how do you create documentation in an agile environment?
Well, so I am so biased on this particular topic because I'm old. And I had mentioned that my entry point into IT back in the day was in project and program management. So I'm an old waterfall guy. And Agile to me was always problematic as it kind of gained, a footing in our development methodologies because of the documentation piece, right? So I think that Agile hasn't successfully achieved critical mass in creating quality documentation as a methodology up to this point. I don't think that that's. I don't think that that's. Well, it is problematic, but I don't think that it's an Achilles heel. I think it's just a reality again that in this go fast world of delivering business value, the need to actually rationalize and explain what code is doing has been, for the most part, cast aside. So I think that the only answer to that is achieving successfully greater levels of maturity with Agile and Scrum within any given organization, which takes a focused commitment and it takes a disciplined approach that many companies are just willing to forego. And I think that's unfortunate because obviously, like the old waterfall guy is going to say that Agile has delivered exponentially more value than waterfall ever did. And you're talking about somebody that used to manage 150,000 hour monolithic code releases on a 3 time a year basis. And the value that's being delivered against that model is so much greater using Agile. But the inability for us to invoke discipline and frankly, quality into Agile has, just been a titanic struggle. And I think that it can only be solved on a company by company basis with the application of focus and discipline and a demand to, achieve the expected deliverables that are required in Agile as opposed to just ignoring when they're not actually delivered.
Yeah, and I think it's a maturity thing too, right? So DevSecOps teams, which to me is kind of the evolution of Agile. Now you can have gate, right? Both of documentation gate, compliance gate, and security gate and quality gate. Not everything, is chaos. Moss was mentioning here, Agile is chaos. I would argue that's only true when you have less mature teams, which is probably what you find in the government, unfortunately. Still, um, Agile to me is control chaos if you do it well, right? So there is chaos, but there's a
Well,
component of control.
yeah, I think there's also a lot of marketing on Agile, right? I've walked into companies. I've actually walked into my own development team at one time, and I said, "Do you guys use Agile?" And they go, "Yeah." And I said, "Well, how? What's your release cycle?" And they go, "Well, our next sprint delivers in 3 months." And I'm like, "You're not doing Agile."
Right,
Right?
right.
Like, so
Yeah.
so we have a lot
Welcome
of
to
people.
DoD.
Yeah,
That's the DoD safe,
yeah,
the beautiful safe framework that is anti-agile just with its name. So
yeah. I mean, just because you're using whiteboards and post-it notes does not mean you're actually
yeah,
achieving Agile
it's all about the
development.
post-its. It's all about the post-its. Don't you know that? That's all it takes. Post-its. But back to documentation. I think funny enough, I'm gonna plug something here, but I think it's pretty funny because when I wrote the code of my Chat GPT bot, I did not write any comments, any documentation in the code in the API. But at the end of it, well, at least at the my release, I asked the bot to write the the comment, and it took my code and added all the documentation for me. So maybe the answer is gonna be, using a bot to do it for us because we're lazy people. In fact, 80% of the code was actually created by the bot, including the logo. My logo I'm gonna release soon was completely created by the bot. The UI, the SQL, the backend.
Wow.
I would say 95% of that was done by the bot. I'm just like a pretty face again, so
I do.
it's kind of
I
crazy.
do like. I do like Andrew's comment. Yes, I believe that 3M gets royalties for Agile.
Yes, yes. You imagine how many post-its they solved with this thing. I don't know who got the idea first to do that, but and
Yep.
then there was this movement. I don't know if you remember, but the people in Windows in office buildings they would put Post-its to create shapes and things and communicate. I know in New York City it was huge. They had different windows, and everybody was like putting stuff in the window with stickers, making shapes. And I bet 3M was in on this somewhere. That would be, that would be surprising. It's on GitHub, but it's a private repo. I don't do open source. I'm a greedy guy. We're gonna make a lot of money with this. To answer Gerald's question, and the name of the company is gonna be Ask Sage. So we're gonna call it Sage. It's gonna be a woman, of dear robot, and it's gonna be obviously a wise woman. So kind of a play there between Sage and Wise. And we're starting with pretty big DoD use cases. Um, we ingested a good example for people that are gonna laugh, and that's gonna make you laugh too. We ingested JSON, Chinese resume and procurement data that we have, right? And all in Chinese. And I just copy and paste the JSON in Chinese to the bot and just tell it to summarize it back in English. And I put it first on Google Translate because I don't speak Chinese, right? So I look Google Translate the JSON. So you see the JSON, you see the fields, you see the stuff in English. Great. You read the stuff as a human, I would not be able to really get to really understand, like, for example, the person, right? I see where they work, I see age, but it doesn't make me a picture, a visual picture of the person. But when I put it into the bot and I was able to say, here is the JSON, and just summarize it. It wrote me like a paragraph, right? Like 3 sentences of who that Chinese person was. And it was just mind boggling to me how now it's like right in front of me. I would see, oh, he's 32 years old from there, worked on this, And so it's just the use cases are just tremendous. I actually asked the bot after ingesting the procurement data, where is China focusing on spending money this month? And he gave us like here's of sectors, boom, 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 summarizing kind of the money being spent on the, because we ingested the procurement data. As a human to do something like this, I'm sure some people can do it, but it's just going through thousands of pages of document in 2 seconds. It's just I think that's going to really disrupt everything we know. So
Yep.
anyway, that
Yep.
was a fun thing.
I agree.
So now, last words to you. I'm going to remind everybody first, before letting you do that, that the next episode on January 24th, 1 p.m. Eastern, we have our dear friend Jody joining us to talk about Harness, the CI/CD DevSecOps platform. So Jody will be on 1 p.m. Eastern, CEO of both, your CEO, I guess, of Traceable AI and Harness, and he has a fund, a pretty significant fund, a VC fund as well. So we'll talk about all that stuff and how he manages to do so much, with so little time, right? So that's going to be interesting. And with that, last words with you, Richard. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, I would say that one of my questions to JT when I was having an interview with him was, how is it that you do 6 times more than I in the same 24 hours? So definitely for the folks watching, look forward to you tuning in and learning from JT. From my end, obviously, I'm passionate about the issues of security in the digital world for everybody. And I'm just, thankful for the opportunity, Nick, to be on your show, the opportunity to be out there. Check me out on LinkedIn if you want to see where I'm speaking next. I'll be out on the trail starting in about 2 weeks, and probably at every one of the major conferences and out on the East Coast here about March as well. So look forward to meeting any of you in person if that's an opportunity. And thank you very much for the opportunity to have the conversation.
All right, thanks everybody. You stay safe and you keep up the great work so our kids have a fighting chance at winning against China 20 years from now. Stay safe. See you soon.